Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is your host, Julia, and today I'm going to welcome Michele Katz of the Plus One Foundation. Plus One is a resource for those people who are thinking about adopting. It gives you access to education and coaching and guidance, generally about what the adoption process is all about. Michele and I actually share a geography, and that is that I have visited the orphanage from which one of her children was adopted. You see, Michele has two children who came to her through adoption from Colombia, and two that came to her family through her biology and her giving birth to them. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you manage and balance all of the different needs of a family that is composed in such a way, including how you support the native culture of the individuals that came to your family from another country. So in Michele's case, she actually uses Spanish as her primary language at home, and she has a couple of other tips and tricks for how to welcome in family members from another country and to include their culture in your own. This is a wonderful episode. I hope you find it engaging. And if you do, please share it with friends who might find it useful. Don't forget to like and review and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and subscribe to our newsletter. I think we have a really great newsletter. As always, I hope you enjoy it. Here is Michele. So welcome, Michele, to Stork'd, the podcast. This is the podcast in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. And you have a really, really fascinating family dynamic that I'm excited to learn more about. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, so you and I have a lot in common, actually. Part of it is a journey to figure out what we want and an exploration of a number of different paths, and actually an orphanage in common in Colombia. So I'd love to hear if we could talk a little bit about your journey to get to where you are now. And maybe we'll start backwards. What does your family life currently look like?
I guess I would describe it as a blended family. I have two adopted children and two that I carried. So I did go through the pregnancy experience to the end twice. And my adopted children, those are my girls, and they are the bookends. And then I have the two boys that I carried in the middle.
So tell us how that bookend structure came to be, how 4 children, 2 girls, 2 boys, 2 adopted, 2 that you carried came to be.
My husband's a cancer survivor. He was diagnosed with cancer as a teenager in high school. I know. It was pretty heavy for him, his family, friends, but he was in remission by 16. So diagnosed by 15, remission by 16. And we started dating when we were 19, and we looked into adoption. And we also were interested in creating a family, also through maybe IVF or something. So we knew that was going to be in the cards for us if we wanted to carry.
So that's interesting. So you didn't have that process where you discover that something isn't working the way that you'd hoped and you have to go through the exploration process. You walked into it knowing we're going to have to look at alternative methodology.
Yes, we knew that from the get-go. So in some ways, I guess that saved time and energy. As you go through this process, of family building, there's loss along the way or grief of what you're not going to have potentially, right? And so when I said I do, I already knew that if we wanted to have kids in that way, then that was probably going to be the way we did it. And I was fine with that. I mean, that was just something I accepted early on. You're right. There was no mystery.
Yeah, there's no mystery. And so, with not having any mystery, you can go right into not problem solving mode. I don't want to call it that, but into the tactics of, okay, here's the situation and let's solve for it. So knowing that your husband was a cancer survivor and he was doing well, but would require some additional fertility support, you walk down that aisle, you know that this is going to be your path in life.
Right. So, first of all, he's worth it. He was worth every shot. And so the thing about it is we ran things in parallel. And through my foundation, which we'll talk about more, I'm sure later, I do bring this up with couples or individuals that I'm talking to about running your strategy. It doesn't have to be only one line. It could actually have 2 lines. And that's what we did. And we started trying through IVF. And then we also started the adoption process. not knowing, of course, how each one would turn out. But this way, and I think this really helps, that you know that you are, let's say, adding to the likelihood of success, that one route or the other or both could work out.
Yeah, it's not hedging your bets, because that both feels so clinical and also just sort of not fair. But it's sort of saying to the universe, like, I am really committed to this, and whatever path is the right path, I'm open to.
We found ourselves in the end with both, and I love it. And I find it, our house is so full, with laughter and tears. And yes, there's yelling, and, like among siblings, they fight. And I go, they are truly siblings indeed.
Yeah. And it sounds like that's what you had always dreamed of, is this big, vibrant, loud, rambunctious community household with 4 children.
And 2 dogs.
And 2 dogs. 2 dogs. Oh my goodness. Okay. So you're parallel pathing this. You've got the fertility journey going simultaneously to the adoption process. Both of those are very hard, heavy things, or they can be. Which one felt like the easier process to you?
Oh, wow. They are so different, and it probably depended on when. Obviously, with IVF and getting the negative test results for, a long time, it's really frustrating. And even though you know you're taking on something, like I knew I was taking on this, but then it turned out that we learned more about potential issues with how my body was working and reacting. That was a surprise. So you just never know, right? You do the best you can with the information available. Now on the adoption side, because that can be difficult too, is the waiting. So both can be difficult and both can be easier than the other. It just it depends. People right now are at a great advantage to when I was going through. There were no groups like on Instagram, for example, or podcasts. They didn't exist yet. And also, people tend to be very reserved and secret about what they're going through. And I feel like now, I know that that's still to some extent the case, but I feel like people are more open now about talking about what they're going through. And there are people like you, right, who are very open about their journeys and help others open up, or they can talk to you or other people. Sometimes talking to, quote unquote stranger, right, is easier than talking to, a parent or a sibling or a friend, right? And they love you so much that it hurts them when it hurts you type of thing. And you're not getting that sort of unbiased, more like a therapeutic, person to speak with. And I think that's why I'm doing this now with my foundation, is to help with getting through some of the weeds. Because while I say on one hand, yes, it's so amazing to have all these resources now, it's almost too much. And you don't know what is helpful versus harmful. And that's why we stress credible resources through the foundation.
And I appreciate what you just said. You have better articulated the mission of this podcast than I ever have, which is, that sometimes it's just important to have another voice to hear or to listen to or to speak with, to share your journey and to share what you're going through. And I too appreciate that the world seems to be changing, that there's this movement that's being built from people like you to say, whatever path is okay, and let me give you the information, should this be the right path for you? So we're here right now at this moment of time where you're parallel pathing. You've got this IVF journey, which is sharing some surprises, and an adoption path, which was that quick? Was it hard? Was it long? Tell us a little bit about that.
The first thing we had to figure out was, did we want to adopt internationally or domestically? We had family who had adopted from Colombia 2 kids. And we talked to them about their experience. They were in country. And at this time, it was more feasible. They adopted 2 children, 2 separate times. They were infants, and just great experience. So that turned us on to learning more about Colombia. We learned about other countries too. We did meet with a consultant who talked about much of the differences between international and domestic. And we decided to go the international route. We like the idea of cousin continuity, right? We had these 2 little Colombian cousins who were born and growing up in a couple states over. So we thought, well, we like this idea of this cousin continuity. We thought that might be really neat. So we did our first adoption via a program in Colombia, which blows my mind that you've been there. And of course, we've been there a couple times, because when my first adopted daughter turned 10, we took a visit back Bogota. And it was incredible. We're like, for 2 digits now, we're doing this family trip. But I will tell you that my firstborn is basically gestational. After about 40 weeks, I'm not kidding, 40 weeks, we got the phone call that she was ready, right? And we were matched. She was 4 months at the time. And within 2 weeks, we were on an airplane with a book, The First 12 Months for Dummies. I kid you not. And we read it on the way down. I guess we can skip the first 4 months and just, or so.
So you're reading about parenting as you're going to go.
As we're going, baby. Yes. My husband was a camp counselor. He had younger siblings, but I was the youngest in my family. I didn't have a lot of exposure to kids. We have friends, here in Chicago, and they had us practice diaper changes on their baby before we flew down.
That's a good
our first bottle that we made down there. We were living in an environment with other adopted families. That's how they work it down there. There are certain hotels, they're like bed and breakfast type, and you meet other people who are adopting. We were the only ones on our first child. All the other people who were at the bed and breakfast were on their second and third adoptee. And we're still friends with those families to this day. Some from the US and some from Europe. Incredible experience and bonding for that time we were living there.
It must be interesting for your daughter, too, to have that network, both with the cousins and with these other adoptees that you met when you were in Colombia, of people who've gone through a similar experience as she did, being adopted from another country.
Absolutely. And there's a camp even in Minnesota that at some point we started going to every year called La Semana. And it's 1-week camp, and it's a Latin heritage camp where most of the kids there are adopted from a Spanish-speaking country and siblings. So my daughter was going to this camp where she was no longer the minority, right? She was the majority, and her siblings, her 2 brothers, were the minority. And it was amazing for everybody around to be and learn and dance and sing and do arts and crafts and be at a camp environment.
I love that idea of that camp. And I like how intentional you're being about giving your children this community that is multicultural. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Tell us about raising children that come from another country, that come from another heritage, that have a different language, even different food. How do you incorporate that into your life?
There's a lot of different ways to do that. For us, one of the big ways, and we just celebrated my youngest daughter, her 2 years with us. She's an older adoption. We adopted her. She had just turned 8. And it was, if you kind of picture this, it's December of 2019. And we get the call. We were interested in an older child, and we matched, and we went down there again to Bogota, Colombia. And it was a very different experience because she was obviously older.
Yeah.
Right. And one way that we tried making her feel very comfortable and begin the blend, right? The blend is we speak Spanish at home. Okay. Maybe not perfectly. And I've always spoken Spanish with my kids, the ones that I carried as well as my Colombian born. So that was very natural, but they've always answered me in English because kids, that's very common, especially because we have a bilingual home. I was the Spanish speaking parent. My husband is the English speaking parent. And they go to school. It's an English-speaking environment. Their grandparents, extended family, right?
So it feels more comfortable or more natural for them to answer in English.
Yes, but they understand me. I can tell from the context of, what their answers are that they understand. This time, they actually had to speak Spanish back. And seeing them do it was amazing. It was so great. I was like, oh, they did learn some things throughout their lives now. So that's one thing. Language.
That's actually a pretty major thing. So you're shifting the language in your home to accommodate a child whose native language at age 8 is Spanish. And that feels pretty major to me.
Yes. And now dinner conversations, which would have been in English. So now we were, flipping it, right? And my husband, he knows Spanish well enough, right? And we say he has his PhD in Spanglish, right? Like, he can conversate, and whatever we need to get done, we will get it done. That's one thing. But we just celebrated what we call the Gotcha Day. Have you ever heard of a Gotcha Day before?
Yeah, like a birthday, but it has a lot richer meaning in some ways.
So I describe it to my kids as everyone's got a Gotcha Day, okay? A lot of kids, their Gotcha Day aligns with their birthday, okay? Like my boys. My boys, their Gotcha Day, their birthday is the same date. But for the girls, their Gotcha Days are different because it's when we got them as a new family member. So we just passed the Gotcha Day of my youngest, and it's been 2 years. And the way we incorporate culture that way is, one, we celebrate the Gotcha Day. So we celebrate us coming together with an additional member of our family. And of course, we ordered Colombian food.
And so you have a restaurant nearby that serves Colombian food.
Oh, yeah, several, but there's one in particular that's our favorite. And that is a benefit of living in a big city.
Yeah.
Those that don't live in a big city, there's still many ways to do it. We play Colombian music, or at least Latin music. A lot of Shakira is heard in this house. My girls actually share a room. And I will tell you, when my husband and I, when we gave them the news that there was going to be another child joining our family, I did it by buying Colombian jerseys, soccer jerseys, right?
Oh,
the football.
fun.
I had just had a business trip there. So I got 4 of them, different sizes, and I laid them out on the floor of my room. And it's not unusual to buy gifts when I've come home from a business trip, right? They could tell from the various sizes which jersey belonged to which child. And then there was this one other one. Yeah. So there was this one extra, and they're like, well, who's this for? And I said, well, it's for your sister, who hopefully will be coming by the end of this year. This was the fall of 2019. And they were jumping up and down. My eldest was screaming. She was so excited. And they all pled their case of who was going to share a room, just the way our house structure is. So I initially thought it was going to be my eldest son. He's got bunk beds in his room. He's very much always looking for a playmate. Just personality-wise, I thought it would be. But my daughter gave the most compelling argument of them all. Even though all three fought for her. And it could have completely gone sideways and could be like, no, mom, like, no. Yeah. But they all wanted her. They hadn't even met her. Okay. And they wanted her. So my daughter, her argument was that we used to live in a different house. My boys have always shared a room, even cribs. We had 2 cribs in that room. They always shared a room. And my daughter felt alone. I wasn't aware of this. Okay. She's like, mommy and daddy gets to share a room. Her brothers get to share a room. I didn't think of it that way. I said, okay, this is your opportunity. So the girls are in the same room and it's working out. I mean, of course, there are days where they're kind of like, oh, this is really tough. And that's growing pains. And they've got Colombian flag hanging from their door. You know what I mean? Like they bond. But there's
it's
a
more welcome, right? To come into a place where your siblings so desperately want you and they've been fighting to share a room with you. That's a really sweet way of welcoming a child in. Can you tell us a little bit about, and compare and contrast a little bit about the matching process for your first and your 4th child? Was it similar because you went through the same orphanage? Was it different because of their ages or because of the time period difference between the 2 adoptions?
Absolutely different, very different. So the first adoption, my daughter was an infant. They use something called picture matching. Okay. So you send pictures.
When you say picture matching, is that to help the birth parent make a decision about who feels like the right fit? Or are they doing that to try and make a family unit look similar-ish?
The latter. The agencies are making the matches. The birth mother is not involved in this process. It's different internationally. There's a certain amount of time where the mother has the ability to terminate the rights, and then the care of the infant goes to the agency, and the agency is making that determination. It's very different than in the United States for the most part. We don't have orphanages here. We have foster. It's different in Colombia and outside of the United States. Most countries seem to have orphanages.
So the agency and the orphanage are 2 separate entities. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
You've got these 2 institutions that are using their own set of filters and their own tools to help find the right family for this infant.
Correct. I mean, some of these institutions have both. So while there are agencies within Colombia that liaison with the agencies in the United States, I worked with the U.S. agency who worked with the Colombian agency who has the relationship with the orphanage. They're the ones who made the match. I just want to make sure that's clear.
And they're the ones that know the child best because they're the ones that are living with and caring for and nurturing the child during whatever period. In this case, it was the first 4 months of the child's life.
In the way Colombia was operating at that time is that infants up to a year old were not living in the orphanage. There were families, women primarily, who were paid. That's what they did to serve as the caretaker. I mean, they're basically fostering in their homes. And they had a limit of up to 3 or 4 children at a time that they could be caring for. And then at 1 year, they went into the actual orphanage where the kids are living together in a much larger communal setting. So my daughter, my eldest, never lived in an orphanage. She was in more of this prior to 1 year foster system. And then we met her at the presentation. There's a presentation. It's called Encuentro. It's the first meeting when my daughter was presented to us.
Really, I'm curious to hear about both the matching process and how it was different between the two and the first meeting process, the first introduction between you and your future child.
My youngest daughter, who we adopted at 8 years old, she was from a different orphanage. And, as you do in this process, you get to know the people who are helping you. And we had waited, but it was taking a really long time. And so the representative in Colombia said, hey, why don't you switch your paperwork over to this other orphanage? Because I think I may have met someone a match for you.
Wow.
And we were like, oh, really? So you put a lot of trust in this, right?
Absolutely.
A little faith there. And sure enough, it's worked out. So far, so good. And she's so loving and just such a tender little soul. She was quite malnourished. So there are things that to be aware of with adoption, of course, especially when they're older. What have they missed, right? My daughter didn't go to school very much. So we're involved in getting her caught up. And that's why one of the tenets of the Plus One Foundation is that we're interested in helping families cover post-placement costs. Because if you adopt an older child, you don't always know what you need. If you're working with an agency or a consultant, they should tell you the fees. It should be fairly transparent. But once that child is in your house, and you might say, I think she's struggling or he's struggling with this, that, or the other thing. And it, maybe some social work is needed. There's therapies that relate to attachment. There's all sorts of things. I mean, we have learned so much from our own personal experience. And of course, some of the resources we offer are resources we use.
Yeah. So we sort of skirted the foundation a little bit, but it's such an important and rich offering that you have for people. Tell us a little bit about the organization and how it came to be.
It's called the Plus One Adoption Foundation. We launched in March of 2021. So it's still fairly young, very young. My experience with the second adoption in December of 2019 was really, my inspiration came from that trip. And so to me, I'm thinking, there are so many people who want to be parents, right? But there is this gap between that desire and thinking about adoption as one of those options to build your family. So I was seeing that gap very, very starkly that day. And certainly many people upon our return told me, yeah, I had thought about adoption at some point, but they had the thought, but it never went anywhere. So I thought, well, if we can create more awareness, kind of demystify or debunk some of the assumptions about adoption, my family's perspective, considering we have both, raising the children hasn't felt that different. People say, is it different, raising a child that is not biological? I tell you, with my eldest, I forget. It's not on the forefront of my mind. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're adopted or not. It's they're your kids and they're going to do lovingly, amazingly things, and they're going to do things that drive you crazy.
Yeah. So your experience of parenting children who have been adopted and children who are biologically yours is the same, that the experience that you're having in the discipline and the love I'm hearing, it sounds like it's balanced. There's no difference. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I mean, certainly I have some kids at some times that listen better than others. So it's not that it's identical because no two people are identical. But from the standpoint that one happens to be adopted and the other I carried, right? That to me, there's like a blur there. I don't see those lines there from my own experience. It doesn't differ in that manner.
But does your parenting style have to change depending on the unique needs of your children and specifically whether or not they were adopted? For instance, do you have to communicate to them about how well they were loved in a different way? Or do you do that universally as well?
Not with my eldest and not with the brothers. With the older adoptee, which is my youngest, number 4, and the last, just to be clear, that with her, I do try to be conscientious of the fact where I can see sometimes when she gets overwhelmed in a social, if she's playing with like a lots of cousins and stuff, and all of a sudden she starts getting quiet and she doesn't feel like eating much, I will make a concerted effort. I will sit by her. I will cut her food. I will put my arm around her. I will squeeze her so she feels that. So none of my other children require that. And I do believe that in part it's related to her being an older adoptee. And again, she's only 8. Now
she's had
10.
8 years of experience before meeting you.
Correct. And, there's trauma in life. Okay. So for adopted kids, the nice to meet you trauma, that comes earlier than others. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, right? And people have told me, and I believe it, I can imagine it, that even the change of smell from an infant, right, who's with the biological mother and then transfers, in our case, to a foster mother and then transfers to me. Now, in my eldest case, she doesn't exhibit, and we talk about it, any of this trauma. Okay. I'm not saying it wasn't there, just because someone handles it in a certain way where you don't see it. And she's 16, right? She's a teenager. So, there's lots of trauma with teenagers and drama, right? But in this case, I don't see it. Okay. And at least from what she tells me, because we're pretty open about this stuff. Okay. We always have been open about adoption, any questions she's had. We've always tried to be there with answering whatever questions we could answer and investigate if we didn't know, but we've always been able to answer questions so far. And with an 8-year-old, there is a lot more life there. Okay. There's a lot more potential trauma there. And even though my daughter seems pretty adaptive, I know that in these big social settings, I know they can be hard for her sometimes because I think it's a lot of stimuli. Now I say that, and I think, she's adopted, but I know kids from my friends, right? They're children who exhibit similar anxieties in social situations, and they're genetic.
It's not necessarily an adoption trauma. It may be unique to her, or it may be the way that she's exhibiting, that she's gone through a lot of change in her young life.
Right. So, when people say, well, you don't know what you're going to get in adoption, but you don't know what you're going to get anyway. I mean, even if they're genetic kids, from my personal experience and from what I've seen with other friends of mine who have, kids with, it's very normal, ADHD, and social anxieties. Certainly now with the pandemic, there's a lot of concern over mental health in general. So why she has those specific needs, I can see them on her face, right? Whether it's because she's adopted or not, I don't know. I think it's probable.
It's interesting. So what I'm hearing you say is that you sort of have to parent the child with whatever they're presenting to you at the moment, whatever needs that they have. And you also have to have this lens as a parent that some children, particularly those who are adopted, come with some adoption traumas, with some inherent built-in trauma around the fact that they are separated from their original families in some way.
Well, probably all of the above.
Yeah.
I'd probably say their life trauma before us, because I don't know. She's still quite young. She did live in an orphanage for a couple years before we even adopted her. There are going to be some unknowns. And as a parent, you just parent the best you can.
So your organization and you personally have this mission to educate others. If I were to sit with you and say, okay, I've read about adoption trauma. I understand that it's a thing. I'm considering adoption. should I be afraid of adopting because of adoption trauma? Or how do I think about entering a parenting relationship knowing that this thing exists? What would your answer be?
I think anyone who is entering the adoption arena should treat it like any other way to build their family, where there may be fears, like in IVF, that's not pain-free. It's not fear-free. And there's unknown, and people are afraid of the unknown just in general. But what I think the most important thing is to have the right mindset about it. Okay. What I mean by that is that this child is not your last resort. This is a choice you're making and to learn. So when someone contacts me, and it's easy to do, DM me, email me, it's very easy to contact me. You can have direct access to me. We set up a call. Let's talk about the fears. Because a lot of times the fears are just based on not knowing, right? So when you can educate yourself, and I may not have all the answers. We are an awareness company, basically, an awareness foundation. And our purpose is to get you to credible resources so that you can get as many questions answered as possible. When you're having a baby, no matter how it is, you don't know how that child's going to turn out, whether they're going to be healthy or not, what's going to be their deal, right? You don't know about the wiring, but why not ask as many questions as you can and try to get as many questions answered as possible to help alleviate some of your concerns. No process is easy, and it doesn't end. We started our talk this way. Like, it doesn't end with the child. That is not near the end, right? And I can say that from personal experience that I prefer being on this side of it. I do, because I remember the waiting and the difficulty and not knowing. There's a lot more resources out there now to help with, basically holding your hand through the process. That really wasn't a thing when I was going through. And I do talk to individuals or couples who really could use more of that kind of help during the process. I think that if it were me, maybe I would have too, if it existed back then, using a consultant over using perhaps an agency. There's pros and cons to everything in life, right? And that's what we hammer out. And it's not for me to answer. I'm just providing information. And then whoever I'm speaking to can put that in the pro column or the con column, because that is very individual.
I agree with that. Well, so I have a couple of other questions. I want to be sensitive about time. How does one make the decision to adopt an infant versus a slightly older child? What went into your thought process in making that choice?
For us, at that time, you could adopt an infant, a healthy infant, abroad. You could do that. Now it's more difficult. We wanted to start from as early as we could. We wanted to start parenting that child from as early as possible. It was our first child. When we got to the fourth, we had this discussion. Let's leave the infants for the first-time parents. We did that experience 3 times. We don't, quote unquote, need that. You know what I mean? I mean, you can't see my air quote, but we thought that there was a great need for kids who are older because there are less people who consider adopting older kids. And quite frankly, I felt pretty good about the sleepless nights and the diaper changes in the bottle and the baby bag. I know you're living the dream right now, but at some point you're like you're good.
As far as I understand, it's a phase that sometimes you don't want to go back to.
And it's a busy life here. And so we thought that we could come in later and provide a permanent home for an older child. That worked for us, especially considering she was the 4th child. There is already a 6-year difference. That's not a lot. I'm just saying from oldest to youngest, 6 years. We're like, that's good. It's okay to think about where you want to be also when they're 18 and whatnot. I mean, all the factors. It's like, just make that list. Not everything is weighted the same as something else. But we really, our number one was we thought we could take on an older child. And we did. And I've loved it.
To be honest, some people get to make that determination based on where their family is and what they're looking for in that particular phase in their life. And some couples don't necessarily have as many choices. So as far as I understand in the international adoption community, single people and gay couples can often be limited to adopting older children, depending on which country and which agency and which orphanage, et cetera.
Yeah, even married couples, you have to be married a certain number of years even. So I was talking to someone, this was years ago, who had only been married like a year and a half or 2 years. So they went with a different country. So she went a different route to a different country and got her kids there. And she has 2 kids from Eastern Europe. So even when you're deciding between, say you decide international, the question is where and what are the issues? I mean, we cannot forget drugs and alcohol abuse and fetal alcohol syndrome. So personally, I wasn't comfortable with a country that was known for that. I went with a country that had a very excellent adoption welfare system. And there's a lot of reasons why some countries are better at it than others.
Well, let's talk about blending the family a little bit. We've spent a lot of time talking about the adoption process, but at some point you've got an adopted child and you become pregnant once and then twice with your 2 boys. How did you talk to the kids about the way in which their family came together? How do you talk to them about one of you was born in Colombia, one of you was born from my belly? Like, what's the conversation around their origins?
Yeah. And you can use words and they're words that you understand, but then you realize that the words are not understood by your children. Okay. Yeah. So here's an example. When I was pregnant with my first boy, the first brother, my daughter has known her adoption story from the moment she was placed into our arms, that we looked all over the world for her, that we went to Bogota, where we were matched with her, right? I mean, we don't have to spare a detail, okay? She knows the whole story. Yet, when I am pregnant with her first brother, she goes, well, when I was in your belly, we are using terms that these kids, remember, she was only 3.5. They don't get it. They don't understand. You say, when you use the word adoption, blah, blah, blah. They don't know what that means until you get real biological with it, okay? And what I mean by that is, yes, there is a child in my womb, okay? And we would say belly, right? Even though that's not accurate, actually. But, we use that too. So, she'd be like, well, when I was in your belly, and I say, well, you weren't in my belly. You were in your birth mother's belly. That's the terminology that was current at the time. Okay. And she has a name and we use her name. Okay. So we're not shy about that information. Okay. Because I'm her mom, but her birth mom has a different name. And that's okay. Right. I mean, that's how it goes with adoption. She was in somebody else's belly. And she goes, oh, okay. And when you explain it like that, you normalize it and don't make it, as soon as you're keeping secrets, and I'm not saying things should be definitely age appropriate. Right? Information should be released upon when you're asked. Do you know what I mean? Not necessarily just pouring out a thesis because they're not ready yet necessarily. When they ask questions, that means that they're ready to a point, and then they're ready to another point, and then they're ready to another point. I mean, she's always been, I guess, the barometer on information. And it's the same thing when I was nursing afterwards. She actually used this. She goes, well, when I drank from your pecho, she actually said that. It's like, when I drank from your pecho, I go, you didn't drink from my pecho. You were a bottle baby and you never got sick. So she was all proud of herself, the ones I carried were the ones who got sick way more often with the green boogers and all that jazz, good times, going to preschool and all that. And she never did. She was
That's amazing.
Very rarely got sick. I go, you're my bottle baby girl and you are so strong. You just never get sick. So you explain and then you put a little positive on it,
That's cute. Yeah.
Positive. Even to this day, this was recently, and this is, kind of a laugh. My eldest said, I didn't wreak havoc on mom's body like you did. She said, so levity, right? Reality with a little splash of humor can go a long way.
Oh, that is incredible advice to close out with. Thank you very much. Michele, I have one more question for you, which is now that you've got 4 beautiful children, you've finalized your family, you've got that dream that you said that you wanted from the time that you were a young kid yourself. So you have your family. What does family mean to you?
Forever, security, warmth.
Wow, I love those. We haven't had those words before. Those are good words. I'm getting chills.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that. And parenting is not easy. As soon as you think you got it, as people say, it changes. But if it's something that you want, and there's so many people who want it badly, I definitely think adoption is a worthwhile route to at least explore.
That's beautiful.
I definitely would like people to know that they can reach out to me on Instagram. It's at +1 adoption, which is PLUSONE. adoption. They can also email me. I can either provide it here or maybe in the credits if that's something you want to include as my email address.
Let's do it. That's great.
But it's mkatz@plusoneadoption.org. We have a website too, which is www.plusoneadoption.org. So it's all very consistent. Hopefully you can find us.
And, I think this is such a tremendous resource. And so I just want to make sure that people know when and how to reach you. You've talked to us about the how. What are some of the things that people can reach out about? What kind of questions might you field?
A lot of times it's just, I've had the notion that I want to adopt. I don't even know what questions to ask, and that's okay. Some it's more specific. I want to talk about like what's open adoption. What does that mean? Or it can be, how do I decide between international adoption and US adoption? Because you really you choose a route. I've never met anyone who's gone both directions there. And age of adoption. Age has come up a lot too. And all we do is we just chat about it. Tell me, what is it like? What's on your mind? Let's talk about it. And we brainstorm. And there may be some resources then that I can pass on. And it doesn't mean it's a one-time thing. Maybe you get stuck in some other place. You're always free to, boomerang back and let's set up another call or email session, whatever is easiest for that person. I do have a full-time job outside of this is my passion project. And I do feel very strongly that kids should have a permanent and loving home. They will be better people for it. And so will you, if adding to your family is something that you want.
It's almost like the best friend who happens to have all the answers, or maybe not even all the answers, but just more resources than you do, somebody to turn to. Well, thank you so much for donating your time to us today.
Thank you.
Sure, you're going to get a lot of people with some questions.
That would be great. I look forward to it.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.
I am thrilled to share and extend a free level 2 subscription to the California Cryobank Donor Catalog by using the promo code STORK'd, that's STORKD, at cryobank.com. You will receive free access for 90 days, which is an $145 value.